Hi, I'm Dr. Bernard Starr with a report on climate change. Why current efforts to stop climate change are not working, why they aren't working, and what we can do to succeed. While we are absorbed in attending to domestic and international political, economic, and social crises, and the brutal Russian invasion of Ukraine, the world is not paying sufficient attention to perhaps the greatest threat to the sustainability of life on this planet, namely climate change. With persistent and accelerating warnings that time is running out, the world's responses are inadequate for preventing global catastrophes. Old-time comedian Henny Youngman once quipped, "A doctor gave a man 6 months to live. The man couldn't pay his bill, so he gave him another 6 months." As we approach and pass points of no return, are climate scientists gratuitously giving us more time that we don't have? My article in Op-Ed News speaks to the continued repetition of failed strategies for achieving net zero carbon emissions and proposes a plan that has possibly the greatest chance of stopping climate change. The article is titled, "Repeating the Same Failed Responses to Climate Change Illustrates Albert Einstein's Definition of Insanity." Repeating over and over actions that haven't worked and expecting a different outcome is a classic example of what Einstein called insanity. But first a comment. There's some controversy about whether or not Einstein actually said that. But frankly, I don't think it matters because the statement can stand on its own. The fact is that doing that, repeating actions over and over that haven't worked and expecting a different outcome, is insanity. And since the earliest warnings about the dangers of human-made climate change, the world has gambled its destiny on a primary solution: commitments from governments and industries to achieve net zero carbon emissions and other conservation goals before the predicted climate apocalypse. Yet this strategy has repeatedly failed. Despite evidence that the planet is approaching points of no return, nations continue to make inadequate pledges, and then they backtrack on them, cheat on them, and insist, in many instances, that jobs in polluting industries are more important than saving the planet or avoiding human extinction. And they will continue to do this because of political, economic, and social pressures. And with periodic disruptions in the world's energy supply chain, as currently in the case of Putin's illegal, brutal invasion of Ukraine, you can kiss goodbye commitments to reduce fossil fuel emissions. Consider, too, that developing nations balk at extreme conservation. They charge that part of the wealth of industrialized countries has come from deforestation, lack of emission controls, and other planet-poisoning practices related to industrial expansion. Now that poorer nations have the opportunity to escape from poverty by continuing some of these practices, they are told that they must take the moral high road which will keep them in poverty. Many of these poorer countries are suffering the most from climate change. They are demanding compensation for the damage, and they are pleading for funding to convert to clean energy sources, funding that has been promised but not delivered by rich nations. It's time to recognize the charade. All efforts, including international treaties, worldwide activism, and technological innovations, have failed to halt climate change and will continue to fail. They are literally dead-end strategies. Scientists have now reached that conclusion as well, and scientists are threatening a strike as a protest against the failure of governments to mount sufficient efforts to defeat climate change. And these scientists see the futility of documenting more disasters, but they have failed to recognize that they can protest and strike from now to climate change doomsday, and governments and industries will still not heed their call. But scientists are looking in the wrong direction for solutions. They should look within. Science holds the only realistic prospect for saving the planet and thus humanity. But for that to happen, we must create a structure much like the Manhattan Project, which achieved the impossible goal of harnessing atomic power. A climate Manhattan Project would bring together the world's top scientific experts to expedite improvements of current technologies and to explore yet-to-be-imagined solutions. For the moment, any rational, honest assessment of the current overall picture doesn't require a crystal ball to see we are heading toward inevitable disaster for the planet and humanity. That's why in January 2022, it was déjà vu all over again when John Kerry, the U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, told the top polluting nations that they must do more to avoid climate change disasters. But we have been hearing these warnings and calls for more action since the release of Al Gore's 2006 film, An Inconvenient Truth. Kerry's sounding was followed by the obligatory expression of hope that there is still time, and conditional ifs. Sadly, though, a long list of unfulfilled ifs has remained constant since the earliest warnings of perilous consequences of climate change. For example, the if calling for sharp reductions in the use of coal is constantly violated. In fact, Kerry noted that rather than cutting back, the world used 9% more coal in 2021 than in 2020. And typical of many countries and companies that promise carbon net zero in the near future, Microsoft reported on March 10th a whopping increase of 21.5% of greenhouse gases from their operations in the 12 months ending June 2021. In 2008, we were warned that carbon dioxide, CO2, in the atmosphere should not breach 350 parts per million to avoid, quote, irreversible effects, end quote. In January 2022, though, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, announced that CO2 peaked at near 420 parts per million. Earlier, in August 2021, the United Nations issued a code red that said, "The alarm bells are deafening and the evidence is irrefutable. Global heating is affecting every region on Earth, with many of the changes becoming irreversible." 3 months later, the World Health Organization declared that climate change is the single biggest health threat facing humanity. Increasingly, extreme weather events, such as heat waves, storms, and floods, kill thousands, end quote. And in case Code Red wasn't alarming enough, as a wake-up call, the latest UN report released in February 2022 warns, any further delay in concerted anticipatory global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. Shouldn't these events convince us that it's time to face a grim truth that underpins the worldwide limp response to the threat of climate change? Humans are acting like a failed species that can't muster the willpower for self-preservation. Biology 101 teaches that self-preservation is a primary human instinct, as it is throughout the animal kingdom. That primary instinct seems to have vanished for humans. In his article, Self-Preservation, The Lost Instinct, David Pinsky, writer on public policy, observes that self-preservation has receded on the list of priorities of human behavior. He attributes that shift to the great success humans have achieved in ensuring the fulfillment of basic needs. He says, "We've been disconnected from the lower levels of the hierarchy." But without attention to the lower levels, he adds, "We do things that we know are bad for us, that can kill us, that decrease our chance of survival." The ability to invent ideologies and beliefs, a cognitive function unique to humans, can also override the self-preservation instinct. For example, libertarians who refuse proven life-saving vaccines. They say, "I will not be told what to do." Then there are anti-vaxxers and climate change deniers who believe that a deity will intervene to protect them, a belief that has proven disappointing. The widespread retreat from self-preservation warrants a radical shift in the strategy to defeat climate change. We should urge the continuation of present efforts and commitments. At the same time, rational world leaders must embrace more dramatic, planet-saving measures. They must make a total commitment to a climate Manhattan Project similar to the World War II Manhattan Project, which created the first nuclear weapons, beating out Japan and Germany and thus ending World War II. And amazingly, in less than 3 years from the authorization of the Manhattan Project on December 28, 1942, to the detonation of the first bomb on July 16, 1945, the impossible goal was achieved. A climate Manhattan Project could develop breakthrough technologies, including safe atomic energy, to stop climate change on a timetable short of nature's timetable for an apocalypse. Current technologies like carbon capture, which pulls CO2 out of the atmosphere, are helpful, but they're far from turning the table on climate change. More promising, on February 7, 2022, the UK-based Jet Laboratory announced the good news of a breakthrough in the development of nuclear fusion, which has the potential for producing unlimited supplies of clean energy with no greenhouse gases. But the bad news is that the process is not expected to be ready for commercialization for at least 20 years. Worse, and this is a quote, "the fusion would need to scale up, which would mean a delay of perhaps another few decades," end quote. This absurd timetable in the context of a dire crisis screams the urgency of a climate Manhattan Project. I mean, imagine the atomic bomb was developed in 3 years knowing virtually nothing about atomic fusion. And now they have a breakthrough technology that's going to take possibly 50 years to develop. Seems absurd. When in 1961, President John F. Kennedy set the goal of a moon landing within a decade, it seemed like a science fiction fantasy. So little was known about space travel. But Kennedy's radical promise was brilliantly realized. Since then, scientists have broken through other space travel barriers, proving that if you set the goal, provide the structure, and assemble the talent, scientists will turn improbable science fiction into functional facts. In a face-off with climate change, science holds not only the best prospect, but perhaps the only prospect for accomplishing self-preservation, an instinct that sadly humans have recklessly abandoned. Will it require a colossal catastrophe for governments to wake up and realize the insanity of their repeated failed actions, and then provide massive resources for science to set a new course that offers genuine hope? Science has produced miracles in the past and can do it again. Thanks for listening. I'm Dr. Bernard Starr.